of dispensationalism. He's got a little consonance going there with the D's. Definitions of dispensationalism. That's real important. The particulars and the all right. Well, welcome to El Paso Bible Church this morning to our Sunday School hour. I am here holding coffee leisurely on purpose because I am at leisure. We're watching a video here today that is done by Dr. Mike Stallard. We're finishing up the second half. So if you're tuning in online here to our stream, you will probably benefit from going back to last week as well. But you can go ahead and start where we're starting on this video called Definitions of Dispensationalism. It's from a conference that I attended back in March that I go to every year, or try to, Chafer Seminary Pastors Conference. And this was a real important one that Dr. Stallard did. He is previously the head of the PhD department at Baptist Bible Seminary out in Scranton, Pennsylvania. But since 2016 has been working with the Friends of Israel ministry. And so he's continuing that work. And so we'll have some time for questions afterwards, or comments, or clarifications. We will have, much to Larson's chagrin, we will not have time for snide remarks, but just questions. So, enjoy.
Okay, let's come back in, getting our...
Uh-oh, I guess it didn't hold the pause.
Wrote a book, Prophecy in the Church. He was a good man, Reformed Presbyterian guy, conservative, didn't understand dispensationalism and didn't like us. But he made a very important statement, which I think helps to frame the discussion. And no covenant guy is going to argue like he does today. We'll talk about that. But here's the statement. He says, little interpretation has always been a marked feature of premillennialism, and dispensationalism has been carried to an extreme. Now look up here. You are an extremist. I'm an extremist. Now what's our extremism? Here it is. We have seen that this literalism found its most thoroughgoing expression in the claim that, here it is, Israel must mean Israel. You extremist. You horrible person, you. And that the church was a mystery unknown to the prophets, first made known to the Apostle Paul. Then he says, now if the principle of interpretation is adopted that Israel always means Israel, that it does not mean the church, then it follows of necessity that practically all of our information regarding the millennium will concern a Jewish or Israelitish age. Let me give you the Alabama paraphrase. He's saying if you take the Bible literally, the dispensationalists are right. Today, the debate has shifted some. We get into the use of the Old Testament and the New more, and it's there's not a single covenant guy that's going to say, and as ALLIS would say, hey, I have the right to interpret prophecy in a non-literal way. But the covenant guys today will say, no, I'm being literal when I allegorize. That's the way they talk. There's a new sophistication in the debate that's going on. But I keep going back to this. There is a clarity to who we are. Now, the third point, the doxological unifying theme, I want to talk about a little bit. I have two diagrams here. I've got this one. It's my diagram. Notice the boring pastel colors for covenant theology and the exciting, colorful dispensational chart. Okay, let me do that again so you don't miss it. Boring, exciting, boring, exciting. Okay. This was Ryrie's third point. I think it's misunderstood. I won't take the time. I'm going to have this diagram later. The covenant diagram with its covenant of grace idea. Covenant of grace is the lens by which they read the whole Bible. And it's focused on individual redemption. So they've been accused, rightfully so perhaps, as being anthropocentric, man-centered. Now they would cry about that because they're so big on sovereignty. But really it comes across like that sometimes. But the individual redemption and everything else that just is not there, at least very diminished, if it is. Whereas dispensationalism is different. And Ryrie was responding, and by the way, he wasn't saying by his doxological unifying theme of the Bible for dispensationalism, he wasn't saying that covenant theology guys don't believe in the glory of God. That wasn't his point. He also was not saying that covenant guys don't practice praising God and glorifying God in their individual lives. That's not the point. The point is, which theological system better gives God his due? See, that he was answering a charge from the covenant guys. Said, you guys chop up the Bible. You got all those dispensations, all these other distinctions, and you throw them out on the road like roadkill with nothing to bring them together. And that's why they would accuse us of being like higher criticism. And Ryrie said, you're wrong. We do have something to bring it all together. It's God-centered. It's the glory of God. Ephesians 1. Go read that. And this is my diagram to try to explain Ryrie's point. Now, a little disclaimer. The black eye at the top of the pyramid is not the all-seeing eye of the Illuminati. This is just a device to help me make a couple of distinctions. The distinction between individualistic things inside the triangle, programmatic things outside the triangle, and also outside the triangle, inverted order. Creation, redemption are the labels that I'm using there in history. And this is where the dispensations flow. I don't mention the dispensations. I didn't want to. I wanted to show that we have some conceptual things there beyond the dispensations. But inside, we got God's plan for angels. That's the black, all-seeing eye of the Illuminati. You have God's plan for the salvation of individual men. I made that a big block on purpose because they say that we diminish individual redemption. Well, I'll tell you, my individual redemption is the most important thing to me. But that doesn't mean it's the most important thing in God's worldview. As you put all of theology together, there are a lot of things that God is doing. He's doing individual redemption of men who trust him. But he's also doing a plan for the nations, doing a plan for Israel, doing a plan for the angels, has a plan for lost men. God is doing a multifaceted program, which Ryrie would say better gives God his due than the covenant focus on individual redemption of men. You see the inverted order, creation of the world, creation of the nations, creation of Israel, creation of the church. That's in chronological order. Those things brought into being in history. On the backside of that, the beginning point of the final push of toward the consummation, rapture of the church, restoration of Israel, judgment of the nations, redemption of creation, happened in reverse order in history. And the dispensationalists of the late 1800s, early 1900s talked about this all the time. And it demonstrates the greatness of God in history, His great glory. And Ryrie said, this is what pulls it all together for us. Positives with this definition, taking the Bible as God gave it and meant it for the original audience, is always a good idea. The Old Testament has an autonomy for its own interpretation. I don't need to have the book of Revelation understood before I can understand Genesis. It allows for the significance of the progress of Revelation for Bible interpretation. And it describes the modern historical movement of dispensationalism with a measure of precision. And I am almost through. I want to show you the picture of a handsome fellow. One of my students found this for me. I don't remember who it was, but it was Emil Gare. This is Pastor Emil Gare. Arnold C. Gabeline converted from post-mill to pre-mill largely because of this man's book, The Future of Israel, written in 1856. It was written in French, translated into English and into German. Gabeline read it in French. This man, Emil Gare, was a seminary student at John Calvin's seminary in Geneva. And he and another student were expelled because they refused to join in voting to censure a former student who wrote a little pamphlet criticizing all the professors at the school who were also pastors in the area. And he wrote that to censure them because they had stopped believing in the deity of Christ. Calvin's seminary, the Enlightenment had demolished them. And so, Emil Gare, in response to that, just he and his buddies, they went out and started a church on the outskirts of Geneva. John Nelson Darby showed up there in 1837 and spent about 6 months teaching and preaching. Gare writes this book in 1856. He gives 3 principles. I wish I had time to tell you how you can find that book easily today. You couldn't when I did my dissertation. He said there are 3 things you need to know about approaching the Bible. 3 principles. Might I say essentials? His first one was literalism. And his discussions about that are very much at home with all of our modern discussions about hermeneutics. Now, he was Presbyterian. He and Darby, they weren't clones of each other. In fact, since he was Presbyterian, he was into elder rule, and I'm only into elder rule if I'm the elder, okay. John Nelson Darby on paper, he's a Congregationalist on steroids. So they knocked heads. And Gare thought that Darby was going to steal his congregation away. And then Darby ends up leaving and goes and starts a church on the other end of Lake Geneva. Okay, so, but they agreed on basic principles of interpretation, which, of course, flowers out in eschatology fairly easily. And literalism was the first one. Second one, diversity of classes and privileges in the entire body of the redeemed. He goes on to explain that this is the distinction between Israel and the church. 109 years after he writes this book, Charles Ryrie pens Dispensationalism Today in 1965. I asked Dr. Ryrie, he had never seen Gare, but he had studied the tradition. And the people in the tradition were studying the Bible. This was their approach. Now, his last point is not Ryrie's third point, the literal value of the word day in prophecy, which, of course, is included in literalism at the top. So he had not gone to that place, Ryrie was responding a lot to the current crisis in the debate with covenant theology in doing that. It is this historical connection that convinced me not to go progressive dispensationalist. I said, no, there's a substantive core that I have to take seriously. Dr. John Walvoord was a saintly man. When I was at Dallas Seminary working on my doctoral program, I was pastoring a church, small little church in Arlington, Texas, and I invited him to come speak at my church. And I was nervous when he came. And afterwards, he did a wonderful job. I preached on 1 Thessalonians 4 on the rapture of the church. My people loved it. I thought they'd want me to leave. I took him and his wife, my wife and I took him out to the Arlington Steakhouse. And while we were eating at lunch, I asked him, Dr. Walvoord, what's the most important issue facing dispensationalists today? And he kind of looked at me and shook his head and says, young man. I was young back then. He says, young man, it's what it has always been. The inerrancy of the Bible. And then I got a little lecturette while I was eating my steak on why dispensationalism is the only system that helps preserve fully inerrancy. Now, he wasn't accusing the other views of not holding to inerrancy. But he says their forced unity creates problems for them they can't answer. But dispensationalists, because we let the Bible go where it goes, can support the distinctions better. So we have a tradition that's substantive and valuable. Okay, that's the end of this presentation. How many more minutes do I have for questions? It's 4:05.
Thank you, Dr. Mike. Could you elaborate just a little bit more on specifically on what Gabriel tended to allegorize?
Okay. Gabeline would go to narratives, even in the New Testament. They do the Old Testament. And his favorite thing, now he would do a lot of different things. He was into Jewish numerology and stuff like that. But one of his favorite things was to find a sequence of 3 things in narratives throughout the Bible and then take them as the 3 dispensations, Israel, church, kingdom. He does that in John 1 and 2. You know, have the wedding at Cana is the kingdom. So then you go back and it has the next day, the third day, the kingdom. Well, those other 2 days was Israel, the church. And so it was a symbolic, allegorical presentation of those things. Now, he didn't deny that those things historically happened like the wedding at Cana, but he was just enamored with this overlay of in the narratives. Now, what led him to do that? There's a little stream of dispensationalism back in his time that believed that every single verse in the Bible was prophetic. I don't believe that. But if you're in prophecy, what do you have to do to make it prophecy? Just believe it. But if you're in narrative and you have to make it prophecy, what do you got to jack it up somehow? You got to do something with it. Okay, so that's what he was doing. And he was searching for that. They were also searching, I think, probably overdoing Christ in the Old Testament and trying to find ways to get Christ into every verse. You know, covenant guys do that now, some of them, and it's a lost cause.
So, for instance, his third day thing, he would maybe go back and tie that to Hosea.
He could, yeah. He would do some of those kinds of things, yeah. Mm-hmm. And he did it everywhere. He did it in Genesis, Exodus. I mean, he's everywhere doing it.
Thank you.
And
And he really never met a conspiracy theory that he didn't like.
Well, he was German. I once asked Dr. Walvoord, I said, I interviewed him for my dissertation, and I said, did you ever hear Gaebelein speak, Arnold's Gaebelein speak? He said, yes, I was a teenager in the church. And I asked Walvoord, I said, well, what was your impression of him? He goes, and he pounded the table. Walvoord did. He says, dogmatic German. And, of course, he was a dogmatic Dutchman. That's who Walvoord was. So I thought that was very interesting. But he was, and I think the Jewish numerology and stuff got him into the mystical side of things a little bit. And I think that's where he went off the rails. Yeah.
Dr. Sollard, very good. Appreciate that. One little thing that seems to be a problem sometime, when we move to the time of Jesus, we have Israel without any question in our mind. And if you're in let's say at the end of the first half of the second century, it's pretty well solved too. But you've got that transition period in which sort of Paul is an Israelite and becomes a Christian simultaneously or something. So that Paul, like in Galatians, that he speaks about, I believe, Jewish believers, he called them the Israel of God. So what do we do as dispensationalists, believing in the distinction between Israel and the church, do with this transitional period in which they seem to be a little of both? And how do we explain that? I think that might be something that people would like to work with a little bit.
Yeah. I do have some of my notes for my seminar. I don't think I've ever published them on the transitional nature of the book of Acts. And I talk about those kinds of issues, even related to salvation. Trusting Christ. Are you looking ahead? What if you're a Jew? You're looking ahead, but he's already died and you don't know it. How's God look at you? So I bring up some of those issues, and I think we just have to let the tension be there. I don't know that we can solve it. At least in my notes, that's the conclusion I came to. I'm going to leave it there. It's a tension. We can't, but there is an emerging distinction that's pretty clear. The Bible's leading us in that direction. Israel is not the church, even when Paul himself as an individual is still practicing some Jewish things. The church is still a different institution than Israel is as a nation. So if that's where you're going with that.
Can you put both at the same time?
Yeah, I think he did. He did. He's talking about the body of Christ at the same time he's talking about keeping some of the Jewish things that he was doing. So yes, it's possible.
You think that part of that might be that he's doing it because it's a historical Jewish tradition and it's not necessarily at conflict with the church. It's just that historical reality in the temple is still there. Yeah. So
being all things to all men, kind of thing.
Well, not quite that. It's sort of like he's still Jewish. This is still their historical ethnic tradition. So therefore doing that, he's not doing it because it has a ritualistic significance for him in the way it is in the law. He's doing it because that's their tradition.
Yeah.
And the temple is still there. So until God says, temple's gone, no more.
Yeah, then he's had vows. Do we have evidence that he actually gave sacrifices?
No. I don't think so.
So I think there's some limits. Tommy has something? Okay.
Yes. Could you clarify a little bit when you said, did you say you were not progressive dispensationalism? Because the reason I asked that is because in my understanding of it all, each one of the dispensations have the bookends of the covenant blessings ending with judgment. In each case, it's as a case trial study for each of scenario of man's failure in proving to the angelic rebellion that will culminate at the great white throne judgment. And in the process, the church is being pulled out as the bride, whereas Israel is being purged in character to be the high priest during the millennium. And in the millennium, they will at the very end have his presence in a perfect world that the human race claims they want, but they will still rebel at the end of it. proving man, even in the best case scenario, fails. Is that progressive or is that accurate? I don't understand.
Well, progressive dispensationalism is the view. There's a lot of things we could say there, but basically they have Jesus on the throne of David today. And I'm not even close to that. Okay, but the thing, when I was in seminary, that was the thing. I sat under Bach and Blazing as they were inventing progressive dispensationalism, and I was wrestling with that. And one of the things, well, maybe not the only thing, but one of the things that just stopped me from going that direction at all was Emil Gare. And I saw this 109-year distinction between him and Ryrie, no distinction in teaching, and talking about core values. And I said, that's not the same thing as their loose idea of our tradition. And so I couldn't go with them. So, yeah, and they believe we're already in the Messianic kingdom.
Well, they had to invent their own hermeneutic to be able to get there.
Oh, absolutely. I live in the Philadelphia area, and I always say if we're already in the kingdom, somebody forgot to tell Philadelphia. Tommy. Oh.
Anyway, real quick, Dwight Pentecost published, just before he died, Transitional Problems in the Book of Acts, which helps with some of the things that were said a couple minutes ago. But my question is concerning the second point, distinction between Israel and the church as part of the sine qua non. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of people outside of our system would embrace that. And so when I had Leitner for these subjects, he suggested, if I remember right, a better tightening up of that would be a understanding that Israel and the church are separate programs. And I was just curious if you had thought about that and would suggest that as a way of tightening things up.
Yeah, I sometimes use that language. Of course, I was trained by Leitner, so I sometimes use that language. They are two separate institutions in history, but also they're the plan of God, two separate plans, two tracks. Yeah. And there are more tracks than the two. You got saints that are in neither of those two programs. So I would go even beyond the two tracks.
I think that's... Incidentally, yesterday morning in church, I did sort of an intro basics dispensationalism 101 that covered a little bit of this, but it went through some other things that Mike's not covering as sort of a basic. But I think, that's the language I use, the distinction. God has a different plan for Israel than he does for the church. That's usually how it's explained.
I think Tommy's hand has been up. It's going to fall off if you don't get to it.
I got Raleigh first before I'll come back to you, Tommy.
Thanks, Robbie. There seems to be in my mind, a false dichotomy here when we just use the term Israel and church. Because in my mind, it's more of a Venn diagram. When you come across, and perhaps I have a bias because I'm a Jewish believer, but whenever you have the language of just church and Israel, the logical conclusion must be that believers in Yeshua who are Jewish are now divorced from Israel and are now part of the church. But that cannot be the case because Israel is a nation created by your heritage, passed from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob through the father, and so on. So, although there's tension there, I also don't see that much tension in that, as Paul, who says, I'm an Israelite from the tribe of Benjamin, he's lamenting over his brothers who aren't believers. He certainly would never say that they aren't Israelites when they come to faith in their Jewish Messiah. It's the most Jewish thing he could possibly do. So maybe I'm just rambling now, but I believe there needs to be, I think there must be a place for the Jew in the church, in the ecclesia, as a believer in Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, but yet only that individual in the ecclesia obtains and retains, I should say, the promises of the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, so on and so forth. So I guess it's more of a statement than a question. Sorry, but there's my 2 shekels. There you go.
He answered his own question.
We'll let you make the statement.
Yeah, you have to realize that the development of dispensationalism was a process coming out of covenantal things, and when you look at the 1800s, you see overall Protestant exegesis is becoming increasingly more literal. Not that they you read all those commentaries from the 1800s, and they're pretty good in many senses, as opposed to even the 1700s and earlier. And so, obviously, people like Gabeline and others carry baggage over, and by the time you reach Dallas, they're the first school that's focusing on dispensationalism. Now, Chafer didn't want to do that, but he was forced to, because he was the guy in the 1930s that ALLIS was investigating, and since almost all of them were Presbyterians, they didn't comport with the Westminster Confession, and so that's why 80% of Dallas guys before 1945 went into Presbyterian churches, but after that, after World War II, they basically were booted out, and so that by the 60s, dispensationalism had become a thought-through, developed thing because of the professors at Dallas and all of this, the first school that really worked on it, and everything. And now we're seeing the absolute decline intellectually of it. Every Bible college in America was dispensational from the late 1800s on, and now hardly any of them are. Or they're very weak or faint and all of those kinds of things. But so I think you reach with the Walvoord, Ryrie, Pentecost era a clarification of what it was, and the earlier guys didn't have all of those things down necessarily, but they generally believed in that. So what's your comment about what I just said on that?
About everything you just said? No, there's development. There's no question that there's development. Of course, the progressive guys point to that to justify their own development, which I'm not with them on that. But that's because they deny sine qua non. Right. They hold that loosey-goosey doctrinal descriptive approach. But I think that's fair to say that there was development, and Chafer is kind of a codification of